Having a 13-year-old is incredible. One of the things that I am loving most right now, to watch my oldest go into the world as like a very independent person. Like, I am so proud of what he's becoming, and watching him be an independent mini person is so fulfilling to me. It's wild. Like, I love it so much.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Kids Are Childfree podcast. I'm really excited to bring you today's conversation, not only because our guest shares so many incredible insights and wisdom into her experience of being a mom, and not simply because she is an incredible businesswoman and someone that I personally admire so much, but because she's also a dear friend of mine. And I have to say that I think we just all too seldom have these sorts of open, candid conversations with our friends about the topic of becoming a parent. Namely, if people are on the fence, we don't really talk about it. We don't really talk about how we make our decisions. Many of us don't really talk about what it involves when we actually become parents, should we choose to go down that path. So the fact that Desiree shared so openly with me and that you get to listen to this really feels like an honor. Desiree Nielsen is a registered dietitian with a focus on plant-based nutrition and digestive health. She's the author of 2 Canadian best-selling plant-based cookbooks, Eat More Plants and Good for Your Gut, as well as the host of an evidence-informed wellness podcast, the All Sorts podcast. Desiree lives in Vancouver, Canada, where she owns a private practice with a non-diet, weight-neutral approach to nutrition and health. I'm super excited to have this conversation because you and I are real life friends outside of being internet friends. And I don't think we've ever really talked about this topic before, talked about you being a mom and what it's like raising kids. And I don't think we talk about this that much amongst friends. So I feel really privileged that you're not only sharing it with me, but that you're going to share it with all of our listeners as well.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. One of the things when I became a mom was like, I don't want to just like mom talk to everybody on like a Saturday night, like I didn't want to be one of those parents who like, oh, I actually like, left my kid with a sitter for 2 hours and all I'm going to do is talk about them for 2 hours. I think that's maybe why, like, I was like, no, I want to make sure that like I have other things to talk about. And then I'm curious about like what's going on for other people as opposed to being like, oh, my kid did the like cutest thing today. Although they do the cutest things all the time, but
Well, and it's funny because I know you love being a mom and you're very involved with your children. But I mean, I was thinking about it last night. I'm like, how long have we known each other and been friends? And I feel like it's probably at least 10 years. Like, I know it was early days in my last business doing jewelry design. And I can tell you, friends, like, I mean, I'm very impressed with Desiree and we'll talk all about that today. But I have seen like the early beginnings and how hard this woman has worked to create everything that she has made happen. So yeah, it's like, we talk about overnight success, but it took 10 years in the making. I can say that it took at least that long, I'm sure. And so I was going to say, like, I think throughout the course of our friendship, it's largely existed outside of your children. And that sounds strange, but like, aside from like bigger group gatherings, it's like you and I mostly spend time either the two of us or with a group of friends as grownups. And so it's an interesting balance that you walk. And I think from what I see, you've done a really great job of also cultivating your personhood, if you will, and your identity outside of being a mom.
I think that was a little bit fear driven. As I opened it, I was like, I just don't want to be that person talking about their kids all the time. But, there was something when I became a mother and sort of like sat there and going like, whoa, okay, I get this now. But then instantly, honestly, that first year, like as soon as I had my oldest, I went out and subconsciously, I'm sure, because nowhere was I like, oh, you don't have kids, let's be friends. But I subconsciously sought out friendships with women who were not only like not parents at this point, but also still single. Like I needed that. I needed that connection. Exactly. I love that you said that, like to personhood, because I loved my child so much, but I saw how all-consuming it was. And I think there was this part of me that was like, you could get real swallowed up by this if you're not mindful. that there
Yeah.
is a part of you that is not a parent. And I think, it's funny that you talked about my career because I've always had these dreams for myself and these goals for myself. But I think what made me as acutely ambitious and even more hardworking than I was before was becoming a parent. And it was absolutely out of that same thing. Like I could wake up 20 years from now, having built this wonderful family and having these great kids, but then also being like, what the heck did I do with myself in 20 years? And so I was like, okay, what do I want and how do I achieve it? Let's go.
Wow. I love that. I mean, first of all, that you had this awareness going into it and in early days. And we're going to talk about early days in just a second. And, I'm sure like most people's stories of coming into parenthood, it wasn't necessarily always a smooth ride, but the fact that you made this real like conscious decision. And I think a lot of people worry that becoming a parent will take them out of their other hobbies, interests, like their identities outside of parenthood. And for you, it's like, if anything, it's pushed you further into it. That's really interesting. And I like it.
Yeah. It's, and it's funny because I think maybe I have never said that until right now. I think there's so many of these things that we do, without our conscious awareness. But,
Yeah.
That drive came from somewhere. And I honestly do feel like that's the exact moment.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's start at the beginning. So, how old is your eldest? How long have you been a mom for?
Oh my gosh. So my oldest is 13 and a half, which is
well into teenagerhood.
yeah, that is a shift for me. That's definitely one of those moments in your life where my kid is starting high school. What the heck? And then my youngest is 8.
Okay. All right. So, have you or did you always know you wanted to become a mom? And whether yes or no, like how did it then decide to happen when it did?
Yeah. So I always knew that I wanted to become a mother. There was never a moment that I thought I wouldn't. The funny thing was, growing up the way that I did, I wasn't sure that I wanted to be married. I was raised in a single parent household. My mother and I were a unit, like us against the world. And so I always had this like really positive example of what it's like to live in the world with a child. And so I was like, absolutely 100%. I can't imagine my life without it. But yeah, I was like, I don't know about getting married. And then I met this person very early in my life. I met my husband, Jim, and, like a hair after my 20th birthday, which is so weird nowadays. Like it sounds so old fashioned. I do not consider myself an old fashioned person whatsoever. But like I just knew and we just knew. But there was definitely, because we were so young, we had a lot of living to do. We spent a lot of time apart. I had work that took me, away a lot in my 20s. And we just sort of waited for the right time. And, we got married in our late 20s. And then I think, so I was just a hair before my 31st birthday when I finally had my first.
Okay. All right. And tell me about that entry into motherhood. Was it at all like you expected it to be? What were some of the surprises? I mean, was it overwhelming?
It's funny because there's this weird, and I 100% believe this has to be hormonal, but you get this sort of superhuman burst. Like, I can conquer anything. I can do anything. Look what I just did with my body. And that lasts for a little bit. Like definitely the first couple of months, you have so much help. We're so lucky we have all of our parents here. So we had so much help all the time. Jim went into overdrive. Like my first was born a good solid month early. And so we were on this really rigorous feeding schedule. So he was up every 3 hours with me, like helping me like breastfeed and then like, doing the dishes and doing the laundry while I'm up. Like he was up while I was up. And I was like, oh my gosh. So we lived in this like adrenaline bubble for a few months, going to brunch still, being like, we got this, no problem. And then around 4.5 months, the hammer just came down, right? I think the adrenaline wears off. The baby wakes up and I was like, oh, I have a personality now. I don't just sleep for a living. And that's when we were like, okay, things are different now. This is much, much, much harder than I thought it was going to be. And that's when the real fun started.
Okay. I sense a little facetiousness there. So yeah. So what was the fun that you encountered, if you can be so honest and open, which I know you will be?
Yeah. So when I say there's adrenaline, there is adrenaline. Like you're just so elated and you're like, I can handle never sleeping for more than 2.5 hours at a time. And you're just going. So one of the things that happened was that my son was just all of a sudden so much crankier, so much more awake, so much crankier, not doing the napping that babies are quote unquote naturally supposed to do.
Yeah.
He wouldn't nap for more than 15 or 20 minutes at a stretch, which means sometimes I would be trying to take a shower for the first time in 3 days and having just got him down and I hear him crying again. And then I'm crying in the shower being like, I just want to not be stinky. And it was just, we weren't sleeping at all. And it really started to catch up to us. And of course, when you are sleep deprived and when you are stressed, you are not your best self. So you just don't have the resilience and the reserve to handle the normal things that come at you. And I remember probably when my son was about 6 months, it was a Friday night, and Jim's parents walked through our little apartment door. They just looked at us like they were there for 15 seconds max. And they went, we're going to take him for you for a sleepover. Jim and I were we must have looked like, I don't think you can do that. He's only 6 months. I don't think he can do a sleepover. And they're like, pack the milk, pack the bottles, pack the diapers. And they just took my child and walked away because that's obviously how much we were thriving at that point.
Yeah. How was that for you? I mean, I hear for a lot of moms, it can be really, challenging or almost traumatic to part with your child for the first time, and having it happen unexpectedly. Was it maybe good that you just had the rug taken out from under you, so to speak, or was that really challenging?
It was just shocking. We were in shock and we're I don't know. And I honestly don't even know what we did, because I feel like we probably just stood there slack-jawed for a half an hour being so I think we probably got some food, but then we went to bed. Yeah. And we slept for 12 hours. And as soon as I was awake, I was like, I have to go back to my child. But 12 hours of sleep changed everything. And, I think that was one of the biggest challenges. Jim and I were so excited about being parents. We were so ready to be parents. But the sort of physical requirement of being a parent, and each kid is their own thing. I had friends who were like, oh, well, my child slept through the night after 3 weeks. I was like, oh, that's nice. I am losing my ever loving mind because I've been sleep deprived for months.
Yeah.
So there's always that sort of reality that hits. But the other challenge is as I mentioned, once those things happen, once you start to get stressed, once you start to lose sleep, you lose your reserve. And then when other things get dicey, when other things get challenging, you're not often your best self. And that's sort of when the real stuff hits the fan.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in terms of, you talk about things getting dicey or challenging. Was it other things then coming up with a baby, or was it other things going on in your life that you didn't feel equipped to handle? Or, I don't know what you were doing business-wise at that point. Were you working still?
The first time I had a child, I was on an actual mat leave because it was my, one and only full-time job in my career. And so I didn't have to work, but I just didn't know what to do with myself. I was used to working 60 hours a week. And then when all the first baby visits come and go and our parents are there, but they're not there as much. So I was alone alone with him and just like doing the feeding and doing the washing and staring at my four walls and going, like the highlight of my day was going for a walk.
Yeah.
You know, like I would try, I was like, oh, well, I can work out. I'm going to try and work out. And I couldn't work out because I could never get him to nap. And so like I would, throw on a workout video and 5 minutes later he'd start crying. Like it was just that idea that like you couldn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I could do was be with him. And maybe for some people they were okay with that. I felt not okay with that. And it was so hard. And so, I walked a lot, raining, not raining, like whatever. I was like, I would just like go as long as I could. He wouldn't nap unless he was in the stroller. So then that sort of forced you out more. And then your husband, who gets to leave, just like magically leaves the house. And of course he does because he has to work and make a living. But you're like so resentful.
Yeah.
For, nothing that his fault. But as soon as he would walk in the door, I would like, not throw, but just like, here's your child, take him from me. I need like not to be touched for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And he's exhausted from his day. So it starts to create this tension.
Yeah.
For sure. Which, like I hear it and I was like, well, that's so ridiculous. Why couldn't I have like had more perspective? And I was like, I could not at that moment have any perspective. Like it was physically and psychologically impossible.
Yeah. When did things start to feel a little bit better or maybe a little bit more easeful? Like, was it months? Was it years? Was there a time?
Years.
It was years. Yeah. And do you remember like what it felt like to turn that corner or what had happened where you're like, oh my gosh, finally?
I do, but it got like so much worse. Like it's interesting. And I know that a lot of people, having kids can be really challenging. And I've met people who, their relationship seemed incredible and then they have kids and then kerplat, like it's just over. And I think one of the things that Jim and I were so lucky to have is that we had a decade together before we had kids. Our relationship was so solid. We never fought, although that's not necessarily like the measure of like a good relationship to me. Fighting is super healthy, but we never fought. We were just so on the same page all the time. And so when things changed so dramatically, regardless of not being able to have perspective, we were able to have that glimmer of, this is you dealing with the adjustment to parenthood. Like you had 10 years of experience and examples of how you guys are like soulmates and best friends. And this is the real you versus this is you now trying to figure this out. And I honestly think that's what saved us. Because there were definitely points when my oldest was a toddler, when I just looked at my husband and I was like, I want to kill you. And I mean it, like, it wasn't until like our son was probably about 4 years old. Like it took us 4 years that we're like, oh, like I feel like we can be people. Like let's go out on a date and like let's actually talk to each other, not like adversaries, but like best friends again.
Yeah.
And then the irony is that's when we're like, oh, I guess maybe we could have another kid.
Okay. And so I was going to ask, so then what's the age difference between your two kids?
5 years.
5 years. Okay. And so it was only after 4 years. I mean, before that, did people ask you, did Jim bring that in the conversation? Like, should we have another child? And you were like, are you crazy? I hate you. Or what happened?
Yeah. It was sort of 50-50. So I'm an only child. And before meeting Jim, I think that, again, because it's like you sort of know what's modeled for you, I was like, being an only child was great. I enjoyed being an only child. So it occurred to me that like we could just have one child. But Jim came from 2 and he was like, it's so incredible. He's like, I know that you didn't have that experience of having a sibling, but having a sibling, like someone who's tied to you for like it's the most incredible feeling. And I was like, okay, I see that. So maybe 2. But then 1 was so hard for us.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know that I can do it. And honestly, we tried when my son was probably, like a year and a half or two-ish, in that zone, like when we're in the depths of our stress and lack of sleep, because he didn't really sleep to the night until he was almost 3. So we tried for probably about 6 months. And I think that I was so stressed. The universe was like, no, this is not for you. And so just sort of put it out of our mind, and honestly thought that we were just going to have one. Mm-hmm. And then, we saw that sort of like light at the edge of the horizon. And I was like, we could maybe. And he was like, we could maybe. But then I said, I'm scared. Like, I feel like we're just now getting back to this really solid, really happy place where we can pick up our kid and be like, oh, let's go for dinner. And like, let's have some fun, not just like in lockdown mode all the time. Yeah. But luckily, the universe doesn't give you more than you can handle. And my daughter was a very, very, very different experience.
So I was going to ask, like, how would you compare the two experiences?
Night and
day
day.
And night? Yeah.
Ooh, yeah. Like the pregnancies were super different. Everything was really different. Like my daughter came out into the world the most chill, relaxed, easygoing. Like she was one of those babies who slept through the night at 3 weeks, and I did nothing to make that happen. Yeah. She's just like, yeah, put me down and I'm going to sleep for like 8-9 hours. No problem, which changed everything, and it's so hard because with your first, everything changes. Yeah. Like especially for us, people are like, oh, I never thought that you guys would want to have kids. And we were like, what? Of course. Yeah. We've always wanted kids. But I think the perception was we were people who really enjoyed our lifestyle. Like we lived a lot. We did a lot. And so I think people were like, well, maybe you won't have kids. So I think that's part of why that shift was so hard for us. Yeah. But then when you have a second, like you're already parents. Yeah. You already have the schedules, that bedtime is at 7:30, like all those things are already a part of your routine. So in that sense, it's a little bit easier. But yeah, she just came out totally different. It was so easy. And I was, already working for myself at that time. And so I didn't really take a mat leave. Like I scaled way back for the first little while, but, she would just be napping beside me on the couch, in between my leg and the couch. And I would just have my laptop and I was like doing stuff. Like it was just, there was so much ease. Yeah. And I'm really grateful for it because it allowed me to experience, wow, this is nice. Like this like little bundle of pudding that like loves me unconditionally and I can just cuddle her all the time. Like, my perception of, having a baby, it's nice because it's sort of like created more of these warm memories around it that sort of like just generally transferred. And I'm like, oh, having a little baby is so lovely.
It sounds like it helped you make peace to a degree with like what had happened with your first and how challenging that was. Yeah. And I think, it's really interesting what you're sharing, because I think people listening need to recognize, and we've got bright people who follow the work that I do, but like your experience can really run the gamut. And I don't know if you can ever really adequately prepare yourself for more of that worst case scenario, which of course there's always worser scenarios, far worse. But to know that like, yeah, it could be like with your first, it could be like the second, it could be somewhere in between. And that really can take a toll. And likewise, if you hear people having more like the nightmare early child scenario, it won't necessarily be yours. It could. And also this vision of like, I picture you, working on your business and you've got your little one beside you. This is, I think, what we idealize about what it's like to be a mom, and specifically like a self-employed working mom. But again, that may not be how life will line up for you.
No. And, particularly too, because the one career dream that I'd had since I was like 18 was like to write a book. And so the me who had never had kids, when I go off on this mat leave, I was like, oh, this is like the perfect time. I'm going to write that book. Oh, no, you're not. You are barely going to wash for like 12 months. Yeah. So I think one of the biggest learnings and one of the ways that parenting made me a better person is that I, up until that point, had a very tight hold on my life and this notion that I could control everything.
Yeah.
And parenthood was this very strong evidence to the contrary. It's like, you are on a ride.
Yeah.
It is simply your job to hold on. You cannot control the twists. You cannot control the turns. You have to figure out how to roll with the punches. Obviously, I got like a D for a couple of years.
But you made it through. Pass or fail. There's no grade. Pass or fail.
Yeah. So, I just barely passed by the skin of my teeth then. But it did allow me to realize that I'm actually not steering this ship. We have this false sense that we control our universe, and we don't.
No. Well, and it's interesting because I remember I had a friend of mine who's a mom to two, and this was several years ago when I was still really in the thick of making my own decision. And I said to her, I worry because I struggle a lot with anxiety, and I don't know how my mental health would fare with having a child, and I would just be perpetually angst ridden. And she said, she struggles with anxiety as well, like many of us do, who are, with the program in terms of what craziness this world is. She said it actually, having a child, if anything, like it did what you describe. It helped her loosen the reins a little bit. It helped her. She also described it as like being less self-focused, in the sense that like you can't really stress and think about your own problems so much because you're now fixated on this little person that you've created. So would you, I'm curious with you, like short term, not even short term, 4-year term, it sounds like it was really a struggle and detrimental mental health wise, but overall, like what's the interplay been like for you with mental health and having kids?
Yeah. And if I had sought out some help, I think in that first year, I'd be interested because I didn't receive any diagnosis. But we know when I think about so many moments, like going to the grocery store with my child and he starts crying a little bit, and then I can't handle it. So I leave my shopping bag and like walk out. Like I was like, okay, I guess I'm not grocery shopping because I can't handle anything happening while I grocery shop.
Yeah.
So it was definitely detrimental, but I didn't sort of seek help for that. It didn't even occur to me to seek help for that. And this was like 13 years ago now. And so we were talking about it, but maybe it just wasn't as like, at no point did a doctor or like one of the nurses at the public health be like, how's your mental health?
Yeah.
But I would say, yes, one of the things that, in terms of my mental health, it isn't all about me. My life by definition is no longer all about me. It is about ensuring that my kids are safe and healthy and happy. And I think it does, that perspective I did not have in the first few years. Now I have it.
Yeah.
Like if something happens in my work or in my personal life, it does give you an incredible amount of perspective of what is important, what is not important. And the really important stuff, you're going to work hard to wade through. But then the other stuff, you're like, no, I don't care.
Yeah. So it's interesting because tell me if this was a thing, but I seem to remember when you had your second child that it was like kind of noteworthy that there was such a big age difference between the two of them. And hearing about it now, what is it? Is it 5 years, 6 years?
It's 5 years, yeah.
It doesn't sound that extreme to me, but I feel like this was sort of like a conversation piece. Am I like thinking about that wrong, or was that the case?
No, it was a conversation piece. Like having kids 5 years apart, people were like, oh, there's a story there. Which is like, now that I think about it, it could have been the story that I had tried for 5 years. So it's like, it's funny how we talk about those things. I was like, actually, no, I tried for 5 years and this is the first time that it actually took. But we were very lucky. It was more of we needed to get in the right place before we had another one. And there are pros and cons to doing both. I think it's more, especially because people aren't having like 8 kids, whereas like, you just keep having the kids as you keep getting pregnant. But now it's more like we're curating. We're having 1, we're having 2, we're having 3, and we're going to have them at these intervals. Yeah. And there is something to be said for, you get out of the 0 to 5 stage sort of like in one piece. Whereas, I carried my 2-day-old baby up the kindergarten stairs. And so like one child started school and then I was like at home with a brand new baby. So we stayed into that 0 to 5 stage, honestly, for 10 years, which is very different. I think for us, I think the universe was very generous to us because that's what we needed. If I was struggling so much with a toddler and then had a newborn, I don't think I would have had all of those positive experiences.
Yeah.
The second time around where I was like, oh, I came out the other side and I'm like, oh my gosh, this newborn stage is incredible. And I love her and I would just want to squish her and hold her all the time. But I know for so many other people, it's like, go through it, just like put your head down and like do the really intense stage. And then both their kids are in school, like in preschool or in kindergarten. And then they're like off to the races. I can see both sides. I think the way that we did it for us is really how we needed to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I also think a lot of it depends on, when and if you meet the partner, when you have your first child, like and specifically for people who don't have this experience that they just know and they've been on the fence for a long time, oftentimes they're pushing this off as long as they feel they can. Okay, if they decide they want to have more than one child, typically it has to happen in relatively short order. If you're 38 years old, you've just had your first, you're probably going to want to think about having your second sooner rather than waiting, let's say, the 5 years.
Exactly. And I think now things are so different. We are so much healthier now than we were 20, 30 years ago. And so there's so many people around me, like friends of mine who are having children at 39, 40, 42. Whereas I think, 15 years ago, we didn't even really think that that was possible. Even having my daughter at 35, immediately you're termed this quote unquote, it's delightful geriatric pregnancy, right? And you're like, oh, okay, over 35 and having a baby, you are a geriatric pregnancy. Let's roll out all these other things for you.
I used that term with someone the other day, and somebody else in our company gave me like a bit of a like big eye look, like, wow, what are you saying, Keltie? And she laughed, and I said, no, this is what they call it. It's a geriatric pregnancy when it's 35 plus, right?
Yeah. That is the medical term for it. We should probably change that.
Yeah, definitely. All right, you want to know what is almost but not quite worse than feeling totally angst-ridden and indecisive about whether or not to have kids? It's other people and their questions about, when are you going to have kids? Or what do you mean you're not sure? Of course you're going to have kids. These kinds of questions and comments can make things that much muddier when it comes to getting clarity on whether or not kids are right for you. That's why I created my Kids or Child-Free Response Guide. It is a free guide with 25 different ways that you can answer the question, so when are you going to have kids? When the answer is, I really don't know. You can find that guide either in the show notes for today's episode or at kidsorchildfree.com under the free resources tab. Okay, can we talk about giving birth a little bit?
Sure.
All right. So I think we've talked about this once before, and I've kind of heard about your experience through other people, so I want to vet how much of it is true. But a lot of people, let's face it, worry about pregnancy and giving birth, and there's definitely a fear element there for, I would argue, sometimes great reasons, and other times it's like just something that's fed into. Specifically, I noticed a lot of people on the fence, and even amongst like the child-free community, if you will, you hear about people who like have legitimate phobia. It has a name, I think it's tacophobia, I believe, not tacos, but
I was going to say taco.
I think it's TOKO, but I might be saying it wrong. In any case, really a lot of fear around giving birth. And you did something, I would say, relatively different, something that I think a lot of people may not have ever heard of, and that is you had 2 hypnobirths. Is that right?
I did. And it's an actual like trademarked program called, I think they've changed it now. It used to be called Hypnobabies, and I think they've changed the name. But yeah, particularly it's always been sort of my bent to if I can do things, I don't know, it seems strange to say it in a natural way, but like I was like, that's always my thing. It's like, if I could do hypnobirthing, like that sounds like really great, and let me try it. So I went to these prenatal classes, 3 hours a week, where you learn all the normal stuff about like breastfeeding and all that kind of stuff. But then you learn self-hypnosis, which I was skeptical enough about, but there was a little voice inside my head that said, this is literally like a mind game. So you just have to pretend to believe it, and then maybe it's happening. So you learn how you listen to these scripts, these suggestions, and you learn a couple of tools to try and hypnotize yourself through the process. And someone who is hypnotized can talk to you just like I'm talking to you now. Like, it's not like your eyes closed and you're somehow out of it. But the idea is that pain is a mental construct, which is true. It's a construct of our nervous system.
Yeah.
And that's, you can sort of circumvent that pain messaging so that you can feel everything, but your brain doesn't label it as pain. And part of the reason and sort of the theory behind that is that pain comes from fear. Pain is a defense mechanism to help us, to say, you need to get yourself out of this dangerous situation. So it's a lot of learning that like our bodies were actually designed for this, before we got to, the modern age and we're all about self-actualization. Like, our bodies were designed to like pop out kids.
Yeah.
And so you can feel these things and be aware of your safety in this moment, and then you won't feel pain. And I can say that I had 2 children without any sensations of pain. I felt it all. It was intense. But, well, the first one, the second time, it is how they say, they just want to sort of pop right out.
Yeah.
But I had a pretty lengthy, like 12 hours, I guess for other people it can be a lot more, but 12 hours of labor and no sensation of pain, no medications whatsoever. It was
natural vaginal
awesome.
births, obviously, if there was no medication.
Yeah.
They didn't cut you open. They could have, I guess, though.
Yeah, natural vaginal. And even with, with my first delivery, there was like a little bit of a hiccup in that. I don't know how deep into this. The other thing about people who've had kids, there's like literally no filter.
No. And I'm the daughter of a doctor, and I've gone through my own reproductive health issues with endometriosis. So we can say all the words and talk about all the things.
Amazing. So,
and if you're considering a child and you're not okay with this, you got to go get yourself a little well-versed in like, the world.
Yeah, and it is about, sort of like what this reality is. And because you definitely have a different relationship to your body through this experience. And so with my oldest, my water broke early, the kind of thing that in a childbirth class they say only happens in movies. Like, oh, your water breaks and then you go to the hospital. That's 100% what happened to me like a month in advance.
Yeah.
And so we went into the hospital, and I wasn't sort of like the stages of development. So like the cervix dilating, all that kind of stuff, that wasn't happening.
Okay.
But then we got to the point where it was enough and went in through the process, and like, the baby's supposed to be in like a certain position in order to deliver easily. And if they're not, then sometimes you'll have a C-section. My oldest had his elbow, like his hand on his chin and his elbow literally slowing him down. So like his elbow was acting as like a brake, essentially, trying to push him out. So I pushed for essentially the maximum they allow you before you get into like a surgical option. So it was 3 hours that I had to try pushing with his elbow, stopping him the whole way. And then after I had him and he was like healthy and all things were good, you deliver your placenta and they should be able to just sort of like tug it and it comes out, and it broke. They had to manually remove it, which I also did without any medications, thanks to hypnobirthing, to the point where, and I couldn't tell because there was so much going on, there was a crowd of medical professionals behind the curtain watching all of this happen with me hypnobirthing through this process. So I was a bit of a sideshow through my first delivery.
Oh my gosh. I seriously get the craziest goosebumps. And this is, it is so incredible what our bodies can do. And I'm not like a pain expert, but I've actually learned a fair bit about pain, having dealt with chronic pain, and just, it's pain's produced in our brains, regardless of where it feels like it's happening in our bodies. And so, I fully buy into the idea, and you're walking evidence of it. But my question is, why do you think this is not something that we know more about and that more women don't do?
I think a couple of things. The first is that it's important that we have like these really unfiltered conversations, and we just don't. I think we sell women a bill of goods, about the magic of, and there are parts that are, it is literally magical that you are like producing a child from your loins. But I think we sort of like gloss over the realities, the physical realities, to only talk about like the lovely stuff. And then also, I think that the challenge with sort of talking about hypnobirthing, like my story sounds fake. It sounds like I am making it, like I am a health professional. I am bound by ethics to tell the truth. Like, it sounds fake. And so I think one of the challenges is that this program might not be available to everyone. But there's also like, if it didn't work, because I've had friends who've done the program and it didn't quite work that way for them that it did for me. And so what we should be very careful with women is that, we don't ever want to make you feel like your experience, if it doesn't match the sort of quote unquote idealized version, is that it's not your fault. It doesn't mean you did something wrong. So I think it's a really hard thing to talk about because we want women to know that like everybody's sort of like on their own journey with this, and it's going to look different for everybody, and that's okay, and then that's normal. But yeah, I think in terms of like, hey, maybe check out hypnobirthing, and if it works for you, great, and if it doesn't, at least you had some good education that maybe will carry you through. I don't know, next time you get a tattoo or something.
Yeah. I just think, what's the harm in trying? And, I can even say, and I have both a belief in like a healthy dose of, maybe it's not healthy. I have skepticism like that, like the next person, but like I had to have a surgery a couple of years ago and I was really nervous to go under anesthetic. Maybe wisdom teeth, but like not truly put under. And I was quite terrified about it. And I kept just listening to this track over and over again that was telling me about this great surgical experience I was going to have. And like, I was pretty chill going in there and I just had a great experience. And I also feel like I remember the anesthetist, she had these like beautiful eyes and she was so kind. And I was like, oh, I like your eyes as I'm like falling asleep. And it was just, it was really good. And so I'm like, if we have a phobia or, there's areas in our life where we're struggling, what's the harm in trying? Because I think without it, was it a total game changer? Of course I was a bit nervous, but I think I would have been a wreck going into that surgery otherwise. Yeah.
And hypnosis does sound like something that's not, and I think one of the biggest barriers is hypnosis sounds like something that's not medically validated, but we have many instances, like I'm a gut health dietitian and there are gut-directed hypnotherapy programs for folks with IBS that have actual clinical science behind them and like quitting smoking and all that kind of stuff. So yes, if you hear this, it's worth checking out.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. It's funny. It's funny that you talk about what you do work-wise. I know we've talked about your business a little bit, but I have to say, it's funny to have a conversation with you, not really about your work. And I think it's also kind of a novelty for you. I mean, you were saying like you're excited to have this conversation. It's something different to be discussing, but I do want to talk a little bit about the work you do. I know you've got some really exciting things come up, but first, so, let's set the stage here. You have 2 published cookbooks with Penguin Random House, which is an incredible global look at the sides of your books. If you've never heard of Penguin Random House, if you've read books that have published under this house. They are Canadian bestsellers. They're fantastic. I will have shared that at the beginning, but Good for Your Gut and Eat More Plants. And I know you have a 3rd book coming out, which we'll hear about soon. You've appeared on broadcast television and radio, and like, you're somebody who just really impresses me. I call Desiree one of my fancy friends because she does all these like really cool things and feels very big league and is somebody that I really aspire to in my own work and field. So how do you manage to do those things to produce, not just quantity, but quality while raising 2 children?
Most days I ask myself how I do it. It's interesting because I mentioned up, earlier that I think I have this career, the fact that I actually achieved these things, I think I have parenthood to thank for that because it lit the fire under my butt. Like I just had this general notion that, these dreams might happen to me one day. And I was like, no, you need to make this happen. And you need to make it happen now. You can't wait 2 years. You can't wait 5 years. You need to start now. So I think I have parenthood to thank for that. I have parenthood to thank for my efficiency.
Yeah.
Because, definitely after I had kids, one of the things I said was like, wow, I wish I could have harnessed this efficiency before I had kids because then I would probably be president of the world. But you don't sort of like unlock that level because you're like, I have time to do these things. And then all of a sudden you don't have time. So I think part of it is that. The other part is that it's just really difficult. Like I have some envy for people that I see doing the kind of things that I do who don't have children, because
Yeah.
I know that, again, there is another level to unlock. Like and I'm in my 40s, so I've been a parent for 13 years. I'm in my 40s, and that, 60 hours a week that I used to put in and like not really think about it, I
Mhm.
don't have that in me anymore. So I do envy people who have that opportunity. But it is about getting really clear about how much time you have and how you're going to spend that time. And I really try and block out my time. But it is hard, like especially after the pandemic. Like I've worked from home for over a decade, and so when 2020 hit and we were all home, the thing that I had to grapple with is I'm not used to doing this work with other people around. And that's the hardest
Mm.
part of like doing the kind of things that I do. And you're recording videos for Instagram, and then my husband comes up for a coffee in the middle of it. Like I actually got like video of like I'm trying to film, and he's like, "Oh, sorry, I just needed a coffee." And like him like walking behind me trying to get a coffee. I was like, "This is my work. I need to
Yeah.
do this." So yeah, I would say it's a balance, and it is the learning to let things go. It is that perspective of like what is important, where are you going to spend your time? Yeah, and it's just a big old ball of chaos that now I'm very equipped to roll with, and I was not before.
Yeah. Well, and I think, we know that what we see on surfaces isn't what necessarily goes on behind the scenes. Of course, it has nothing to do with what's happening behind the scenes. And I appreciate that people are speaking more openly, but I still think we often see portrayals of motherhood, especially alongside running a business, where it just looks like everything's just in like perfect order. And I think, that's false.
Yeah, well, and maybe it's true for some people.
Yeah.
Maybe their personality is that they just roll with things so much better. And also, honestly, particularly in my world, one of the things, like if you're scrolling through people and you have all these people you follow on Instagram or YouTube or like whatever, so many of those people have big teams and they've got a lot of help. Like
Yeah.
I don't have a nanny. I do have my mother, whom I couldn't live without. Like my mom
Yeah.
picks up my daughter at 3 p.m. so that I can work until 5, so I can have a full work day. So she stays with my daughter for 2 hours
Okay.
every day. I couldn't do that. That's 2 hours in a work day. That is vital.
Yeah.
So I do have a little bit of help, but a lot of people who do this, they have teams of 6.
Crazy.
Why can they do like an Instagram live Friday at 5 p.m.? Where are their children? Their children are being cared for by someone else
Yeah.
so that they can do it. So I think it's important that the internet can be such a beautiful source of community, because you
Yeah.
can find someone who's going through what you're going through with,
Mhm.
but it can also be a horrible source of comparison. And you cannot compare what you see online to your own lived experience.
Yeah.
You just can't, because we will, even when we're trying to be, quote unquote authentic, we will still always project the most thoughtful version of our chaos or our struggles online, because that is the nature of that. So I think
Totally.
that if you're struggling and if you're like, why is no one else, we are struggling along
Yeah.
beside you. We're just not telling the world about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying so. I know with your work, you've often been been brought away from your work, or chosen to travel, when you're promoting a book, for example, or you're going to an expo, you're giving a talk. And I specifically remember this from like when your second was quite young. And it's funny because I got a funny little story. I was telling Chris about this conversation we're going to have, and a couple of these questions I said, I'm going to ask Desiree how she manages to do and be all these things and also simultaneously have children, and how she can travel with work. And I said, what bugs me about me asking her this, though, is that nobody would ever ask a father how they manage both. And so I kind of had to catch myself. And he said, yeah, but that's different because fathers don't do it. I mean, I think he says something like they don't do anything, or they're not working half as hard. And I thought, bless his heart. I mean, he appreciates, and we know a lot of fathers, Jim sounding like one of them, and who we know, of course, who are very hands-on and very involved. But I appreciated that he had the sensibility to know it's not the same. And that is why we were asking these questions. Also, there is, and maybe this is the second part of the question, there is still this idea that it's not healthy or good for children to be away from their mother, at all, if possible. And so talk to me about that and how you as a family and yourself navigated that both decision as well as the doing of like, I'm going to be away sometimes.
Yeah. I think it's such a juicy conversation. As a mother, I am very lucky. Jim is one of those fathers. He, particularly because he had a working mother, both parents were very busy. He and his brother had to help out. They had to do chores. They were like, it was a family that came together to run the family. And I'm really, really grateful for that. And I do agree. Part of it is because we hold the role of motherhood so dear in our society that we do sort of like elevate mom's status a little bit. And in a way that often I will say, it's like, I don't want that for us. Like we have two parents and I feel so lucky that we're in a 2-parent household because there are 2 people to handle that load. And I think that it should be spread out equally amongst us. I think though, as moms, we tend to think of things in a different way. And like we had this conversation because I was talking to my husband because one of the things that I mentioned is that I'm a pretty open book. But in having these conversations, I feel like my family stories are not mine to tell. And so I wanted to sort of sit down with my husband before you and I talked. And he said, one of the only things that would give me pause and that I would bristle at is this idea that like mom does everything and dads do nothing because that's not who I am. And absolutely that's not who he is. But we had this interesting moment when I was like, oh, but I shared this thing that when I first, because I always traveled, like I was already in a job where I traveled before I had my first child. And I remember that I would go on business trips early on when my oldest was, like 1, 2, or 3. And before I went on that business trip, I would do all the groceries. I would make the meals so that all Jim had to do was heat them. Like I was doing all of this labor before I even went on a business trip.
Yeah.
And, now I'm just like, I just can't do that anymore. Like that I'm spent. Like that
Peace
A++.
out.
Yeah. That A++ parenting / wifing. I just can't do it. And so he said this interesting thing to me and it really crystallized so much in my mind. He's like, that was so wonderful. Like I saw you doing that, but I didn't ask you to do that. Like we would have been fine had you not done that. And it was just like the other shoe dropped. And I was like, I did this to myself.
Yeah.
All these years of extra laboring and, the little micro resentments to come up, I did to myself. Because in my mind, I wasn't like, hey, Jim, I could use some help here. And that just really crystallized. So like anyone who might find themselves in this position, like it's talk with your partner. Like really be honest about what you can do and what you need help with. Because I do think that I overlabored for many years simply because I was so stressed and thinking that I couldn't ask for help, that somehow this had to be on me when it didn't have to be on me whatsoever.
Well, and I feel like it's a sensitive thing to say. A lot of women won't like this, but I do think there are instances in which we sort of martyr ourselves. And I even find that sometimes with Chris, where he'll offer or extend something, or I could very much ask for his help, or he'll say, well, we can do that later together. And it's like, no, it's fine. I'll do it now myself. I'll just do it. I'll do things without asking. And sometimes it's nice, but if you're doing it from a place of resentment or to like score keep and hold it against them later, that's not fair either. And I think it also then creates sort of this expectation or this like way of being where it's like, okay, well, that's just what we do. That's how we operate. And so they almost then become, kind of like they become reliant because it's been like trained, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think it is different for each one of us.
Yeah.
But we are sold this bill of goods where the mom has to do it all, like that we can have a career, but only if we don't, quote unquote, drop the ball at home, which is a load of garbage. Full stop. When you said we don't ask dads this, and it is because we do sort of like say motherhood is this. And, people are like, well, don't you miss your kids when you're away? I'm like, yeah, but so does my husband when he goes on a business trip. This idea that, obviously being in possession of a uterus. I was able to do a piece of this parenthood thing that, my husband was not, right?
Yeah.
So full stop, yes, 100%. Like pregnancy, childbirth, like that's all on me. But parenting doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And, I think we do our husbands a disservice when we assume that they don't have that deep attachment to our kids that we do, like it's just as much as it's making it hard on us, it's making it hard on them. So yeah, I think it's important to have these conversations with your partner about how you will, and maybe someone makes more money, so it makes sense, and they work 70 hours a week. So like for your family survival, like that's just how it's going to be. But if it's in a more equitable situation, it should and can be equitable. And yeah, I think the traveling is one of the things that I noticed when we stopped traveling for a few years. The traveling is my release valve.
Interesting.
Because you've got so much going on all the time. And if, even if I'm just flying across the country for 48 hours, which most people are like, oh, that's so hard. And I was like, honestly, a 5-hour flight without your kids is a day spa, right? Like I can catch up on work. I can catch up on emails. I can read a book. I can read a movie. It was my little release valve to like, when I wasn't sleeping, I can get 9 hours of sleep tonight in a big bed. No one's going to wake me up at 5:30 in the morning. And I realized that was part of one of my little coping mechanisms as a parent that I lost for a couple of years. And now that it's back, I'm like, oh, and my husband and I,
it up.
Yeah. And my husband and I have both agreed it works to a point. Like 3 days is the like, I'm fine. I don't really miss my kids for 3 days. This is awesome. I'm going to eat what I want, do what I want, watch what I want. And then 3 days are like, dang, I kind of miss my family.
Yeah, totally fair. Totally fair. Okay, Desiree, before we wrap things up, I have a few more questions for you. We're going to get into some rapid fire questions in just a second, but I'd love to hear what we've talked, we started talking about a lot of the struggle. I know you've talked about many of the things you love about being a mom, but I'd love if you could just share a couple more things about in terms of what you find most fulfilling and what you love most about being a mom.
What I love most about being a mom, and it's so hard because it's always what you're in is what makes the most sense to you and what you're thinking about right now. But having a 13-year-old is incredible. One of the things that I am loving most right now is seeing, because when you're kids, it sounds weird to say, I'm like, of course they're humans, of course they're people, but no, like they're your tiny people. You're still feeding them and like telling them what to wear, all this kind of stuff. To watch my oldest go into the world as like a very independent person, like, going for lunch with his bestie at the Tim Hortons, because that's what's like, I am so proud of what he's becoming, and watching him be an independent mini person is so fulfilling to me. It's wild. Like I love it so much.
I have to say, like, even as a non-parent, seeing my friends' kids, like, sort of, I mean, they're not like coming of age, I guess, is more becoming a grown up. But like, I think what's interesting, especially, and this is going to vary depending on how people raise their kids. I think maybe you see this a little bit more in some urban environments, but even my friends' kids who are like 10, 11, 12, like they're so clued in, they can connect and engage with you on a pretty grown up level. And yet they still have obviously this beauty of childhood. Like I have to say, I really enjoy it. And we're seeing with all of our nieces and nephews, not all of them, but many of them are now coming into like the teenage years. And Chris said to me the other day, like, it makes him want to spend more time with them and to get to know them in like a new way. And they have this sort of independence from their parents. It's very cool. And I can only imagine if it was your own child, just like how fulfilling that would be.
Well, and it is that getting to know you, like, 'cause when they're really, little, it's different. It's the cuddles and the like, oh, isn't it funny and cute, this thing that they did. But now I'm like, oh, I want to dig around in your brain. Yeah. Like, what are you thinking? Like right now, what are you thinking? What do you care about? What are you worried about? It is this, like, I really do get to know you now and who you are, because who you are is something separate from who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, I mean, you saying that, of course, is a whole other conversation, but just the fact that you can recognize that your child is their own person, and to be able to discover that, and they're still obviously evolving and growing and getting to know themselves, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Okay, Desiree, I have 5 rapid fire questions for
Okay.
you. The first couple are like, finish the sentence. So first one is, being a mom is,
A ride.
being a mom is not,
Ever what you think it's going to be.
what is one thing that you think would make this decision perhaps a bit easier for women who are on the fence? And it could be something like culturally speaking, it could be something on the individual level, but something that might just bring a little bit more ease.
It's impossible for you to make the wrong decision.
Yeah, I like that. All right, what is one thing that you would like women who are child-free to know?
That who you are as a person has nothing to do with your reproductive state.
So good. All right, and lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that be?
If there's even an inkling of want, of desire, lean into that a little bit more. As a mom, I can never, and as a mom who really wanted kids, I can never be in the mindset of someone who truly doesn't.
Yeah.
If you truly don't, oh my gosh, don't. Like I said,
Yeah.
like who you are as a person has nothing to do with how many progeny you put out into this world.
Yeah.
You are a person. But if you're like I think if it's more I think I kind of want to, but I'm scared of certain things.
Yeah.
The fears can be worked through.
Yeah, I agree. Good advice. Okay, the end has come, but before we wrap up, you have some very cool projects. One in particular I'm thinking of, but I would love for you to just share, like, what is it you're working on? Where can people find you? What are the things they need to know? This is your big platform, Desiree, the Kids Are Child Free podcast. So make your spiel.
Amazing. Well, if you like delicious food and you're into eating more plants, I have a new cookbook coming out called Plant Magic. And it's not about labels. It's just about eating really delicious food that so happens to be plant-based so that you can get more of it into your life. And you can find me on all of the things, mostly Instagram and TikTok, but my website is DesireeRD.com, and that will keep you connected to lots of free recipes and everything that I'm doing.
Awesome. And we will be sure to link to everything that Desiree just shared in the show notes. When does the book come out, and is pre-order available, or when will it be available?
The book comes out April 23rd. And pre-order is actually available. I haven't even, as of the moment we're talking, I haven't announced anything yet, but it is on all of the online things. And pre-orders are so helpful to an author because the more that people pre-order the book, the more that retailers say, hey, people are interested in this book. So they buy more physical copies to put in their stores.
Yes. And if my understanding is not incorrect, those numbers also then basically like get released, so to speak. Think about it as like, I don't know, all these sheep come to mind. Don't ask me why. Behind a gate, and all of a sudden you open the gate and the sheep run through. We need to queue up the sheep behind the gate for when launch day happens, right? Because all those sales in the meantime will like help impact your rankings, which allows you to get seen by more people, which means more people can buy and support your work, which means more people are eating delicious food and getting healthy and all that. Is that right?
Yes. And it's what makes books bestsellers.
Yes.
So because you can sell the book and there could be months and months of sales that'll magically come out on release day. And, so when a book is a bestseller in the very first week, that's why. So if you know an author, if you love an author, the greatest thing that you can do for them is pre-order their book, every couple of years before it comes out. It means it's a game changer for us.
Yeah. Well, I know when this episode airs, it'll be at some point either in January or early February. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure by then you'll be singing from the rooftops.
Yes.
I can tell you, and this is not because Desiree is a dear friend of mine, but because, so we eat plant-based at home, out of the house, a little cheese slips into the diet. But we cook from Desiree's cookbooks all the time. They are not just cookbooks, but they're a wonderful resource for eating a really healthy, balanced, delicious plant-based diet. Even if you love your steak burgers, which, we need to talk, but we can do that a different time. You want to check out these books. I visit Desiree's blog all the time. She is like my definitive go-to research all things body health place on the internet. check it out. I can only like sing her praises. You'll hear me and see me talking about this as the book's coming close. I've gotten a sneak peek of what it looks like. Love the cover design. I peeked at the link you sent, and I did say to Chris, I was like, is this available? Can we buy this? Like, have I gotten this before everybody else? So yes, go pre-order the book. And while you're at it, check out her other couple of books, Good for Your Gut and Eat More Plants, so that you can order those as well. All right, Desiree, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really appreciate your openness, your honesty, and just everything you shared. You're a wonderful person to know. I have so much admiration for you, and you are a wonderful mom to your kids.
Thank you to you for creating this space, because I think for, so many people, these are big questions, and there are not a lot of places where we have open and honest conversations that explore all perspectives and all sides.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, now that we've wrapped up today's conversation, this is the part of the episode where I tell you that you need to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And you really need to do that. And I'm going to tell you why. And that is because one of the big ways that people find and discover new podcasts like this one is through reviews. So if you yourself can go say what you loved about this podcast, why people who are on the fence should tune into the Kids Are Child-Free podcast, that's going to help other people who are also wondering, should I have kids or stay child-free, to discover us. Thank you in advance for doing so. I will be featuring some of the reviews in upcoming episodes, so maybe I'll share yours. You never know. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you back here soon for our next episode.